There is a book that popes placed on a banned list. Napoleon supposedly kept it tucked under his pillow during his military campaigns. Joseph Stalin annotated it heavily in the margins with a red pencil, and practically every modern politician has either read it or is very actively pretending they haven't. It is remarkably short, just 26 chapters. You could sit down and read the whole thing in about 3 hours. But the truly wild part is the origin story. It was written by a man who was completely unemployed, totally broke, and physically recovering from being strung up by his wrists and dropped from a ceiling repeatedly until his shoulders dislocated. He wrote this little manual in the dark, hoping a powerful family would give him a job. They didn't. They probably never even opened it. His name was Niccolò Machiavelli, and the book, of course, was The Prince. 500 years later, we still use his name as a synonym for something cold-blooded, calculating, and ruthless. Calling someone Machiavellian is either the greatest insult in the history of political thought, or it is the most revealing thing we have ever said about ourselves. Because Machiavelli didn't invent deception or cruelty, or that massive gap between what leaders say and what they actually do. He didn't invent politics. He simply did something entirely unprecedented. He wrote it down. He looked at how power operates, not how it should operate, not how the church claimed it operated, not how the ancient Greek philosophers theorized it, but how it actually functions in the real world when the stakes are literally life and death. And polite society has been furious with him for it ever since. So today we are going to peel back the 500-year-old myth and get to the man behind it. I have been deep in the research for this one. We are pulling from historical records detailing the bloody politics of the Renaissance, translation notes by the author Tim Parks, which are genuinely brilliant, clinical psychological studies on the Dark Triad of personality, and contemporary political analyses of modern populism. The goal is to figure out not just what Machiavelli actually wrote, but why his name became a clinical synonym for ruthless villainy, and what his observations reveal about the reality of power today. Whether you are trying to navigate toxic office politics, make sense of modern election cycles, or you are just deeply curious about the darker corners of human nature, this episode is going to give you a completely new lens to view the mechanics of power. But to really understand the Prince, we have to strip away our modern comfortable context and drop ourselves directly into the visceral, chaotic reality of Italy in 1513. We are not talking about a philosopher sitting in a quiet, ivy-covered tower, theorizing about governance over a cup of tea. We are talking about a world that was literally burning. Italy was not a unified country at all. It was a fragmented, chaotic patchwork of warring city-states constantly being invaded. France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, they were all treating the Italian peninsula like a giant chessboard, and right in the bloody center of all of it was Florence, which was Machiavelli's home. The backdrop of Florence during this period is essentially a premium cable drama. The political whiplash is dizzying. Before Machiavelli even sits down to write this book, Florence goes through a series of radical transformations. First, you have the Medici family running things, the ultimate wealthy, scheming dynasty pulling strings behind the scenes. But then the French invade, the Medici get kicked out, and Florence falls under the spell of a fundamentalist Dominican monk named Girolamo Savonarola. Savonarola is a crucial figure if you want to understand Machiavelli's psychological development. This monk didn't just take over, he terrified the city into submission. He orchestrated the famous Bonfire of the Vanities. And we are not just talking about burning a few controversial pamphlets. Savonarola's followers went door to door forcing citizens to hand over cosmetics, mirrors, fine dresses, secular books, and priceless art. There are accounts that the great painter Botticelli actually threw some of his own mythological paintings into the flames out of pure fear and religious fervor. Savonarola ran a brief, terrifying, apocalyptic theocracy. But the public eventually tired of the strict morality. The Pope excommunicated him, and in 1498, Savonarola was tortured, hanged, and burned at the stake in the very same plaza where he had held his bonfires. A young Machiavelli watched this entire cycle unfold. He watched a prophet rise through the power of words and religious fervor. Then he watched that same prophet burn because he lacked the hard physical power to defend himself. Machiavelli noted this explicitly later on. He wrote, All armed prophets have conquered, and all unarmed prophets have come to ruin. Following Savonarola's execution, Florence established a republic, and this is when Machiavelli finally entered the arena. He became a senior diplomat in the Florentine Republic's chancery. For 14 years he was in the room where it happened, traveling across Europe on horseback, meeting the King of France, the Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor, and sitting across the table from Cesare Borgia, the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI and perhaps the most terrifyingly effective political operator of the age. Machiavelli spent time at Borgia's court studying him the way a modern epidemiologist might study a highly adaptable and deadly virus, half in horror and half in awe of its efficiency. He was taking mental notes on how power is actually wielded when morality is entirely removed from the equation. But the pendulum swung again. In 1512, the Medici family came roaring back into power in Florence, backed by heavily armed Spanish troops. The Republic collapsed overnight. Machiavelli, who had been a highly visible senior official for the Republic, was suddenly caught on the wrong side of history. He was unceremoniously fired. And then it got much worse. A few months later, a conspiracy against the new Medici rulers was uncovered, and Machiavelli's name was allegedly found on a list belonging to the conspirators. Just a piece of paper with his name on it. He was arrested, thrown into the Bargello dungeon, and subjected to a form of torture called the strappado. The mechanics of the strappado are important to understand because they tell you something about the psychological state Machiavelli was in when he eventually sat down to write. They would tie your hands behind your back, attach a rope to your wrists, hoist you high into the air using a pulley system, and then drop you, stopping the rope with a violent jerk just inches before you hit the stone floor. The gravitational force and the sudden stop would violently dislocate your shoulders, tearing muscles and ligaments. The pain is described as blinding. Machiavelli endured this 6 separate times and maintained his innocence throughout all of it. He was eventually released because a member of the Medici family was elected pope and declared a general amnesty to celebrate. But his life as he had known it was over. He was exiled from the city he loved, banished to a small run-down family farm in the countryside of Sant'Andrea, physically broken, financially ruined, and politically dead. What followed is captured in one of the most poignant letters in literary history. Machiavelli writes to his friend and ambassador Francesco Vittori, describing his new daily routine in exile. During the day, he is out in the woods covered in mud, arguing with local woodcutters over pennies. He spends his afternoons playing cards and backgammon in a dingy local tavern with the butcher and the miller, shouting over tiny bets, trying to keep his mind from rotting away from the sheer indignity of it all. But then evening comes, and this is where it gets remarkable. When the sun sets and he returns home, he takes off his mud-caked, sweat-stained everyday clothes and carefully puts on his formal, ambassadorial robes. He dresses exactly as if he is about to go to court and address the kings of Europe, and then he steps into his private study. He writes that he enters the ancient courts of rulers who have long since died. He reads history. He communes with the great leaders and philosophers of antiquity, and he writes in his own words, "For 4 hours at a time I feel no pain. I forget all my worries. I am not afraid of poverty, and death does not frighten me. I live entirely through them." It is an incredibly haunting image. A broken man sitting by candlelight in his finery, clinging to his dignity and his intellect in the dark. And it is in that study, wearing those robes, that he writes The Prince. Originally titled De Principatibus, meaning of principalities. He dedicates it to Lorenzo de' Medici, the young newly installed ruler of Florence, the nephew of the very pope whose amnesty had freed him. The context makes the whole thing almost unbearable. This book is essentially a desperate job application. Machiavelli is offering the new ruler, the family that just had him tortured, the only thing he has left of any value, his unvarnished, hard-won expertise on how power actually works. He is saying, "I have seen the mechanics of the world. I understand how the gears turn. Use me." It completely failed. Lorenzo likely never even opened it. There is a story, possibly apocryphal but entirely believable, that Lorenzo was presented with Machiavelli's manuscript at the exact same moment someone gifted him a pack of hunting dogs, and Lorenzo allegedly spent all his time admiring the dogs and ignored the book entirely. Which raises the question we really need to sit with, not just why it failed as a career move, but why a book written by a broken, forgotten man in a farmhouse in the middle of nowhere became one of the most dangerous, celebrated, and argued over texts in the history of human civilization. That is what we are getting into next. Machiavelli didn't offer the traditional flowery flattery that a Renaissance ruler would expect. He didn't tell Lorenzo how handsome or divinely appointed he was. He offered brutal, clinical honesty. He was writing from the desperate, precarious edge of survival, which made his focus on necessity deeply personal. He literally didn't have the luxury of idealism anymore. Think about it like this. Imagine someone writes the most brilliant, brutally honest cover letter in corporate history. They write to a CEO and say, "Look, I know your company is failing. I know your executives are actively lying to you. I know your supply chain is a mess. And here's exactly how to systematically outmaneuver your rivals, restructure your board, and save the business." You send it off feeling like an absolute genius, only to discover that HR just wanted a standard polite template saying you are a collaborative team player with a passion for synergy. You offered them the ugly, bloody truth of how to save their lives, and they just wanted comfort and flattery. That is Machiavelli in a nutshell. His honesty was his undoing in the short term, but it is exactly what made the book immortal in the long term, because he told the truth. And this brings us to the explosive core of what he actually wrote. The specific philosophical shift that horrified the world. To understand it, we have to look closely at chapter 15 of The Prince. This is where the grand pivot of Western political thought happens. Before Machiavelli, the entire tradition of political philosophy, stretching all the way back to Plato's Republic, Aristotle, and flowing through medieval Christian scholars like St. Augustine, was entirely focused on how a ruler ought to behave. It was a genre called the Mirror of Princes. A good ruler was supposed to be just, generous, merciful, pious, and honest. The foundational assumption was that if a leader possessed personal moral excellence, good governance and a peaceful society would naturally and inevitably follow, the idea being that a good man makes a good king. Machiavelli looks at that entire centuries-old tradition and says, that is a beautiful fantasy, and if you actually believe it, it will get you killed. In chapter 15, he introduces this devastating concept of the effectual truth, the verita effettuale. He argues that there is such a massive, unbridgeable gap between how people ought to live and how they actually live that a ruler who focuses on the moral ideal rather than the ugly reality will bring about his own ruin. And the mechanism behind this idea is crucial. Machiavelli is not just saying people are flawed. He is observing that the world operates by a specific set of raw mechanics. Dealing with the world as it is means focusing on the practical results of actions rather than the moral purity of intent. He flatly asserts that human beings are, generally speaking, fickle, hypocritical, cowardly in the face of danger, and greedy. Therefore, if you try to be perfectly good among so many people who are fundamentally not good, you will be destroyed. The wicked will eat you alive. So a prince must learn how not to be good, and how to use that knowledge strictly according to the necessity of the moment. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, is he just saying the ends justify the means? Because that sounds like a blank check for villainy. But that is actually the common misreading. Machiavelli never wrote the phrase, the ends justify the means. What he actually wrote was that in the actions of all men, and especially of princes, where there is no higher court to appeal to, one looks at the result. If a prince succeeds in conquering and maintaining the state, his methods will always be judged honorable and praised by everyone. The winner writes the history books. He is not saying that doing evil is suddenly morally good. He is saying that in the realm of statecraft, morality is largely irrelevant compared to stability and survival, and this leads to his famous distinction between being and seeming, which is where it gets genuinely dark. Machiavelli says it is actually dangerous for a ruler to possess all the virtuous qualities and always act on them, because if you are always merciful, you cannot be ruthless when a rebellion sparks. Your hands are tied. But he says it is absolutely essential to appear to have those virtues. You do not need to actually be perfectly merciful, faithful, humane, honest, and religious. In fact, in his view, you cannot be. But you absolutely must know how to project the illusion that you are all of those things. And he specifically zeroes in on religion. He notes that appearing deeply religious is the most important illusion of all, because people judge with their eyes, not their hands. Everyone sees what you appear to be, but very few ever touch what you actually are. To illustrate this, he uses Pope Alexander VI as his ultimate example. This was Rodrigo Borgia, Cesare's father. Think about what Machiavelli is doing here. He is using the Vicar of Christ, the head of the Catholic Church, as his prime example of a successful and systematic deceiver. He writes that Pope Alexander VI did nothing but deceive people. That was his entire life's work. He swore the most sacred oaths, broke them constantly without a second thought, and always succeeded in his deceptions. Why? Because he deeply understood human gullibility. He understood that the world is, as Machiavelli puts it, all crowd. And the crowd is always taken in by appearances and by outcomes. The translation history of this book is actually fascinating here. Tim Parks points out in his research that for a long time, older translations tried to consciously clean up Machiavelli's prose. Victorian translators especially tried to make it sound more archaic, more respectable, more like a traditional high-minded philosophical text. But Machiavelli explicitly stated in his introduction that he refused to prettify the text with superfluous decoration or pompous words. He wanted the raw truth to hit the reader like a physical blow. He was writing a survival manual for a burning house, not a polite essay for a dinner party. The scandal of this raw approach cannot be overstated. By arguing that power is based on deception and force, Machiavelli was directly challenging the divine right of kings and the moral authority of the church. For centuries, the narrative had been that a king sat on the throne because God put him there, because he was virtuous and noble. Machiavelli pulled the curtain back and said, "No, power is not a divine gift. It is simply an arrangement made by those willing to take it using violence and fraud and maintain it through fear." He stripped the divine halo off the monarch and replaced it with raw, earthly calculation. And when you look at modern public life, it feels like we are completely living inside chapter 15. Think about politicians who roll up their sleeves, take off their ties, and eat corn dogs at a state fair. It is engineered authenticity, a carefully performed illusion of being one of the people. Or think about the corporate world. A CEO posts passionately on LinkedIn about company values, empathy, and we are a family. Then a week later executes a mass layoff of 10,000 people via an automated email. We always act so shocked and betrayed when the mask slips, but Machiavelli told us 500 years ago that the mask is the job. We publicly condemn the deception, yet we consistently reward and vote for the best performer. We want the illusion, and on some level, we always have. But if we accept Machiavelli's worldview, that the world is fundamentally dangerous, that people are deceptive, and that morality is a luxury a ruler cannot afford, how does a leader actually navigate things on a practical, day-to-day basis? This brings us to the operational engine of his philosophy, his two master concepts, Fortuna and Virtù. In the classical Greco-Roman tradition, fortune was often depicted as a somewhat benign if fickle goddess, Lady Luck spinning a wheel, handing out good and bad days. But Machiavelli completely reimagines her. Fortune in The Prince is a malevolent, primal, almost demonic source of violence and chaos. He uses a vivid and terrifying analogy. He compares fortune to a raging river that suddenly floods. When it bursts its banks, it destroys everything in its path. It tears down ancient trees, sweeps away buildings, and ruins the soil. When the river is flooding, you cannot stop it. You can only run. But this is the crucial part of his analogy. Just because the river is destructive does not mean humans are entirely helpless. He says that during quiet times, when the river is low and the weather is calm, a wise ruler does not simply sit around enjoying the sunshine. They build levees, dikes, and canals. They aggressively prepare for the flood before it arrives. So when the water inevitably rises again, it is channeled, controlled, and its destructive power is mitigated. Fortune represents the unpredictable chaos of the world, pandemics, economic crashes, sudden wars. But human preparation and strategic foresight can withstand it, and that strategic preparation is what he calls virtù. Now we need to pause here because this is one of the biggest translation traps in the entire book. When we hear the word virtue in English today, we automatically think of moral goodness, chastity, honesty, kindness, charity. That is absolutely not what Machiavelli means. Tim Parks emphasizes in his research that the Italian word virtù shares a root with virility. It means drive, effectiveness, ruthless flexibility, and the acute ability to read a shifting situation and respond to it decisively. It is martial spirit. It is the specific, hard set of skills required to seize and maintain power, what Machiavelli calls lo Stato. And his ultimate shining example of virtù in action is, once again, Cesare Borgia. Borgia was incredibly ruthless, but his ruthlessness was always calculated, never gratuitous. Machiavelli uses a very specific historical episode to illustrate this perfectly. Borgia had just conquered a region called Romagna, which was lawless, chaotic, and overrun by bandits. He needed to establish order. But he also understood that whoever brought the hammer down on the population would be hated for it. So how does he solve it? Borgia's solution was as cold as it was brilliant. He appointed a man named Ramiro de Lorca as his governor of Romagna. Ramiro was known as a cruel, efficient, brutal enforcer. Borgia gave him absolute power to clean up the region. Ramiro went in, crushed the bandits, executed people left and right, and established total terrifying order in record time. The region was safe, but the people absolutely loathed Ramiro de Lorca for his cruelty. And Borgia realized that if he left Ramiro in charge, that hatred would eventually redirect itself upward toward Borgia himself. So one morning, the people of Romagna walked into the public square and found Ramiro de Lorca sliced completely in half, with a bloody knife and a block of wood laid out beside him. Borgia had him executed in the most brutal, theatrical way possible. Machiavelli writes that the ferocity of this spectacle left the people simultaneously satisfied and stupefied. Borgia achieved two things at once. He got the pacified region he wanted, and he violently distanced himself from the cruelty required to get it. He presented himself as the savior who punished the wicked governor. That cold, calculated, theatrical use of violence is what Machiavelli calls pure virtù. But here is the uncomfortable twist. Borgia did everything right according to Machiavelli's rules. He built his levees, he prepared, he calculated, and he still ultimately failed. He lost all his power and died young. So if his virtù was so precise, what went wrong? Machiavelli tells us it was an extreme, unpredictable stroke of fortuna that no amount of preparation could hold back. Borgia's entire power structure relied on the backing of his father, Pope Alexander VI. Borgia knew his father would eventually die, and he had meticulously planned for every contingency. He had manipulated the College of Cardinals, secured his lands, and allied with the right armies. But there was one variable he simply could not control. At the exact moment his father unexpectedly died of fever, Borgia himself fell deathly ill. He had planned for everything except the possibility that he would be on his own deathbed at the critical moment of transition. It perfectly highlights the central tension in Machiavelli's entire philosophy. You can do everything right and the universe can still crush you. Machiavelli concludes that fortune controls roughly half of our actions, but she leaves the other half to our own free will. We are not purely victims of fate, but we are certainly not the complete masters of our destiny either. There is also a deeply controversial metaphor he uses at the end of this section that we need to address honestly. He writes that fortune is a woman and that to keep her under control, one must be aggressive and strike her down. It is a deeply uncomfortable, inherently misogynistic metaphor that shocks modern readers. Tim Parks notes in his research that Victorian translators often tried to soften this language or quietly translate it out entirely. But Machiavelli was explicitly equating aggressive, dominant energy with the conquest of unpredictable circumstance. His point, stripped of the metaphor, is that hesitation and excessive caution are fatal. boldness is the only reliable way to master chaos. Which raises a bigger question. Is virtue basically just sociopathic adaptability? If a cautious person succeeds in business, it is not because caution is universally a good trait. It is because the specific conditions of that moment happen to reward caution. But if that same cautious person fails when the market crashes and the environment demands aggression, it is because they could not adapt. Machiavelli is essentially saying you must be a chameleon. You must become whatever the moment demands. And if we zoom out, this represents a profound philosophical shift in how humanity views its relationship with the universe. To understand just how radical it is, consider the contrast with the 20th century Russian philosopher Ivan Ilyin. Ilyin dealt with the tragedy and cruelty of the world by retreating into a theological framework. According to his philosophy, God made a kind of original mistake in creating the world. In doing so, God fractured and soiled himself. Therefore, according to Ilyin, the imperfection of the world is blamed on a flawed divine creation. The world is awful, but it is God's fault, not ours. Now contrast that completely with Machiavelli. Machiavelli secularizes the imperfection of the world entirely. He does not blame God. He does not reach for a theological scapegoat. He looks at the flawed, brutal, bloody universe and demands that humans adapt to the effectual truth of that reality with no excuses. The world is a mess, the river is flooding, and it is entirely on your shoulders to survive it. That is a remarkably heavy burden to place on a human being. You have to navigate the chaos with no divine safety net, and you have to use whatever tools are necessary to survive. Which takes us directly into chapter 18 and arguably the most famous metaphor in the entire book, the lion and the fox. Machiavelli argues that human modes of combat, which rely on laws, debate, and institutions, are often simply not enough, especially when you are dealing with people who do not respect laws in the first place. So when the human way fails, a ruler must learn to imitate the beast, specifically two beasts. The ruler must be a lion because the lion represents raw, terrifying physical force. It can frighten away wolves. It crushes its enemies. But the lion is blunt. It cannot recognize traps or snares. So the ruler must also be a fox. The fox represents cunning, fraud, and the acute ability to recognize and evade traps. But the fox is physically weak. It cannot defend itself against a pack of wolves. Therefore, you must be both. You must use force when necessary and deception when necessary. You cannot survive on just one. And this explicit endorsement of the fox, of calculated and unapologetic deception, is what transformed Machiavelli's name from that of a historical Italian diplomat into a clinical insult. If we trace the evolution of the word Machiavellian, it starts almost immediately after the book is published, translated, and subsequently banned by the Pope. It travels to England, and on the Elizabethan stage, in the plays of Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe, you get the birth of the theatrical Machiavel. Marlowe's play The Jew of Malta, written in the late 1580s, literally opens with a prologue spoken by a character named Machiavel. This character walks on stage and talks about poisoning people, hiding daggers behind smiles, and viewing religion as nothing more than a child's toy used to control the masses. Machiavelli became a bogeyman, a shorthand for foreign, treacherous Italian evil. But then in the 20th century, the legacy of this book takes another massive leap. It moves out of literature and theater and enters the realm of clinical psychology through what researchers call the Dark Triad of personality traits. The Dark Triad consists of three distinct malevolent personality profiles: psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism. They operate on entirely different mechanisms, and it is worth understanding the distinction. The psychopath is characterized by a fundamental lack of empathy, high impulsivity, and thrill-seeking behavior. It is chaotic and indifferent to harm. The narcissist is driven by a grandiose sense of self-importance and a desperate, constant need for external validation and admiration. They do it for the ego. Machiavellianism is different from both. Those who score high on it are characterized by a cold, calculating, deeply cynical view of human nature. They are not necessarily impulsive, and they do not crave the spotlight. They manipulate others purely for strategic, long-term advantage. It is not about ego. It is cold math. In 1970, Two psychologists named Richard Christie and Florence Geis wanted a way to study this manipulative behavior in a controlled setting. So they literally took statements directly inspired by The Prince and turned them into a psychological survey called the Mach IV test using a Likert scale. For those unfamiliar, a Likert scale is a spectrum. You are not asked to simply answer yes or no. You are given a statement and asked to rank how strongly you agree or disagree, usually on a scale of 1 to 5. The actual questions from this test are striking. If you score as a high mark, you strongly agree with statements like, never tell anyone the real reason you did something unless it is useful to do so, or it is hard to get ahead without cutting corners here and there. And you strongly reject statements like, most people are basically good and kind, or there is no excuse for lying to someone else. In game theory experiments, researchers found that people who score highly on the Mach IV test behave exactly as predicted. They defect from alliances, they betray partners, and they calculate their moves without any emotional interference getting in the way. And if you sit with that honestly for a moment, most people who have navigated a difficult professional environment might hesitate before strongly disagreeing with some of those statements. We all use small deceptions, but a true high Mac does not view deception as an unfortunate, occasional necessity. They view it as the primary default tool of all human interaction. But here is the question that genuinely bothers me about all of this. Is it actually fair that Machiavelli's name is permanently attached to this psychological pathology? The construct describes a cold, unemotional, detached temperament, but the historical Niccolò Machiavelli was intensely emotional. He was passionate. He loved Florence so deeply, he was willing to endure the strappado for it. He openly wept over the political fall of his city. He wrote comedy plays and poetry. And the final chapter of The Prince is a deeply impassioned, almost desperate plea for a savior to unite Italy and drive out the foreign invaders. He was not a detached, unfeeling sociopath. He was a desperate patriot. As researchers on the psychological construct have pointed out, the clinical variable of Machiavellianism has virtually no actual relation to Machiavelli's broader political philosophy. It is a massive distortion. Psychologists essentially isolated his specific observations on deception, completely stripped them of their historical, diplomatic, and patriotic context, and applied them to individual interpersonal manipulation. They took a historical analysis of high-stakes statecraft and shrank it down to help HR departments identify toxic middle managers. But even as clinical psychologists were turning his name into a pathology, the actual strategic blueprints of The Prince were finding very real and very powerful applications in the modern world, not just in office politics, in systems of massive scale, which brings us to Silicon Valley. It is an open secret that The Prince circulates heavily in tech boardrooms, and the reason is not hard to see. Think about the defining ethos of early Silicon Valley, popularized by Facebook. Move fast and break things. That is a deeply Machiavellian concept at its core. It operates on the logic that existing rules and legacy systems are not divine laws of nature. They are simply arrangements made by the last group of people who held enough power to create them, and they can be dismantled by anyone with enough virtù and enough fortune. The tech industry is fascinated by founders who act as princes building new states from nothing. Steve Jobs is constantly studied through a Machiavellian lens. Consider his infamous reality distortion field. His ability to convince people that the impossible was possible through sheer force of will and charisma. Consider his willingness to take credit for other people's ideas. His ruthless, uncompromising pursuit of a specific aesthetic vision, regardless of whose feelings got hurt or how many engineers burned out in the process. These are the traits of a prince. Jobs was not operating on traditional corporate morality. He was operating on the effectual truth of building a product ecosystem that did not yet exist. But the mapping of Machiavelli onto the modern world goes far beyond the tech industry. It extends deeply into modern political systems, specifically into the mechanics of populism and authoritarianism. And I want to be very clear here. We are not here to validate or condemn any modern political figures. We are not taking a political stance. What we are doing is looking at how political scientists are actually mapping Machiavelli's 500-year-old framework onto the architectural blueprints of modern power. It is essential to examine the underlying mechanics and not get lost in the partisan noise. At its core, populism operates by dividing the world into two fiercely antagonistic groups: the pure, unified people versus the corrupt, parasitic elite. The populist leader steps forward and claims to be the sole authentic voice of the pure people's will. And if you read Machiavelli closely, he actually advocated for something structurally very similar. He advised that a prince should always build his power on the foundation of the people rather than the nobility. This is not because Machiavelli was a secret democrat or had any deep love for the lower classes. It was pure calculation. As he observed, the nobility's primary desire is to oppress the people and accumulate more power for themselves. But the people's primary desire is far simpler. They simply do not want to be oppressed. Therefore, the people's desire is more honest, more easily satisfied, and far less threatening to the prince. If you ally with the nobles, they will eventually view themselves as your equals and move to overthrow you. If you ally with the people, you become the undisputed master. They make a more stable foundation for power. And this specific mechanic of siding with the masses against the elite was eagerly absorbed in the 20th century. Benito Mussolini is the prime example. Mussolini actually wrote a thesis on Machiavelli in 1924 called Preludio al Machiavelli. He did not just read The Prince, he internalized it as an operational manual. Mussolini viewed the state as the ultimate organization and believed the people inherently needed the restraint and direction of a strong singular leader. He also adopted Machiavelli's specific military advice. Machiavelli despised mercenaries, arguing they were disloyal and only fought for money. He advocated for arming your own citizens because they will fight for their homes and for you personally. Mussolini took this to heart, which led directly to the creation of the Blackshirts, the loyal citizen paramilitary squads that used force and violence to facilitate his march on Rome. Mussolini capitalized on the immense post-World War I desperation, economic degradation, and fractured national identity in Italy. He projected himself as the modern prince who could save the nation, brilliantly merging populist rhetoric with brutal fascist control. Researchers have drawn direct structural parallels from this historical framework to the rise of Donald Trump in the United States. Looking purely at the mechanics of power, Trump's famous drain the swamp rhetoric precisely mirrors this populist division. The swamp represents the corrupt elite, the entrenched politicians, the bankers, the legacy media. And Trump positioned himself as the sole authentic voice of a pure people, standing against this corrupt apparatus. By actively breaking conventional political norms, by refusing to apologize, and by surviving numerous scandals that would have destroyed a traditional politician, he demonstrated a form of virtue specific to his moment. He performed the role of the anti-politician. And paradoxically, by showing that he was not bound by the traditional moral rules of Washington, it made him appear as the perfect, powerful prince in the eyes of his supporters. They wanted a fox and a lion to fight the establishment. And what this reveals is that the strongman playbook has not fundamentally changed in 500 years. It is still about performing a very specific character during times of massive crisis, economic anxiety, and cultural upheaval. The masses desperately want to believe in someone. They want the illusion of total control in a chaotic world. They want someone who stands up and says, "I alone can fix it." But this raises an important question about the sustainability of personality-driven power. Machiavelli himself warned that while a prince might successfully seize power through extraordinary means, long-term stability requires something entirely different. A regime built entirely on the charisma, rule-breaking, and kinetic energy of a single strong man is inherently fragile. It lasts only as long as that strong man's luck and vitality hold out. Once fortune turns or the man ages, the state collapses with him. Which brings us to what I think is the greatest and most mind-bending twist in Machiavelli's entire legacy. If The Prince is a manual for autocrats on how to seize and hold power, what did Machiavelli spend the rest of his life writing? We have to look at his other major yet far less famous work, the Discourses on Livy. While The Prince is a short, punchy, cynical manual of 26 chapters dedicated to a single ruler, The Discourses is a massive, highly detailed 142-chapter love letter to the concept of republics. In the Discourses, Machiavelli makes arguments that seem to completely contradict everything in The Prince. He argues that the collective wisdom of the people is vastly superior to the judgment of any single prince. He approvingly cites the ancient proverb, "Vox populi, vox Dei," the voice of the people is the voice of God. He explicitly praises the rule of law, the necessity of public debate, and even praises the messy, noisy tumult of a free society. He argues that the constant political friction between different classes is actually what creates strong laws and preserves liberty. The man who wrote the ultimate blood-soaked guide to ruthless autocracy was, in his heart, a passionate advocate for democratic republics. He even writes in the Discourses that a corrupt people can be persuaded by words and led back to a good path by a good man. But a wicked prince cannot be reasoned with. The only remedy for a wicked prince is steel. He is literally providing the philosophical justification and the practical playbook for how to violently overthrow the exact kind of prince he described in his first book. So how do we reconcile this? This contradiction has sparked centuries of intense philosophical debate. One of the most famous theories comes from thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Baruch Spinoza. They believed the prince was actually a secret and brilliant piece of satire, not a joke, but an exposure. Rousseau argued that Machiavelli, a staunch Republican who had been tortured by tyrants, was writing a book that appeared to advise tyrants, but was actually exposing the brutal, deceitful mechanics of tyranny to warn the public. It was a Trojan horse. By writing down exactly how princes deceive the public, he was inoculating ordinary people against that deception. It is a compelling theory. It transforms the book from an evil manual into a manual of resistance. But not everyone accepts it. Many modern philosophers, notably Leo Strauss, argue that Machiavelli was deadly serious in both books and was not contradicting himself at all. He was simply a political scientist addressing two entirely different sets of circumstances. Think of it this way. Think of the prince as a trauma surgeon. When a patient is bleeding out on the table, you do not want the surgeon to be polite, gentle, or collaborative. You want them to crack the ribs open, plunge their hands into the chest, and restart the heart. It is a violent, unilateral, desperate act performed to save a life. That is the prince. Machiavelli believed that when a state is completely broken, corrupt, or needs to be founded from scratch, it requires the extreme, violent, unilateral action of a single strong man to establish order. You need blunt force to reset the broken bone. But once the patient is stabilized, you do not keep the trauma surgeon around for daily wellness checkups. The violent methods that save the patient will eventually kill them if applied every single day. Once the state is established and secure, it can only be maintained long-term through liberty, law, institutional checks, and the open debate of a republic. That is the Discourses. The prince is the brutal surgery of foundation. The Discourses is the physical therapy and healthy lifestyle of long-term maintenance. He was not a hypocrite. He simply recognized that different stages of a nation's life require entirely different tools. And to arrive at this profoundly pragmatic worldview, he was drawing on philosophy that was considered genuinely dangerous for his time. Machiavelli had a deep, intense engagement with the ancient Roman poet Lucretius and his epic work De Rerum Natura, meaning on the nature of things. Lucretius proposed a universe made entirely of atoms colliding in a void. According to this philosophy, there is no divine providence, there is no afterlife, and the gods, if they exist at all, do not intervene in human affairs. Machiavelli was so obsessed with this text that he hand-copied the entire manuscript himself. Hand-copying a massive work about a godless universe while living in the shadow of the Vatican tells you everything about how intellectually fearless and how ideologically serious this man truly was. It brings everything full circle. By stripping away divine providence and accepting the terrifying freedom of a universe governed by atoms and chance, he placed the entire burden of history, politics, and survival squarely on human shoulders. He secularized the acquisition of power completely. If you fail, it was not God's will, it was your lack of virtù. So let us distill this extraordinary journey. We started with a tortured, mud-caked diplomat in 16th century Italy, recovering from dislocated shoulders. We traced his ideas through the treacherous courts of Renaissance popes, onto the Elizabethan stage with poison-wielding theatrical villains, into the clinical psychology labs defining the Dark Triad, into the high-stakes boardrooms of Silicon Valley, and onto the modern political stages of global populism. We have watched a localized survival manual evolve into a permanent mirror for humanity's darkest and most pragmatic calculations about power. And that mirror is the crucial takeaway. If this episode made you uncomfortable at any point, if something made you squirm, It is not because Niccolò Machiavelli invented deception or cruelty or the manipulation of the masses. He did not invent the lion or the fox. It is simply because he dared to write down how the world actually operates without adding a comforting moral filter to protect our delicate sensibilities. He showed us the effectual truth. He showed us the gears turning inside the machine. So as we close, I want to leave you with one final thought to sit with. Think of a leader you deeply admire right now. A politician you voted for, a CEO you look up to, a community leader in your personal life, someone with real power over real outcomes. Are they successful because they are genuinely and purely good? Or are they successful because they have mastered Machiavelli's effectual truth, performing virtue so flawlessly and so consistently that you never once noticed the cold machinery operating behind the mask? Keep questioning. Keep looking closely at the levers of power, and I will see you in the next one.